coming out for our event today. If you are here for Science Cafe, we're going to get started just now. I just want to give sort of a brief background on Science Cafe. So we're actually a component of the Ecology Graduate Student Organization, sort of a subset of that. We started in 2014. I always have to think about that. I should know that by now. We started in 2014 as sort of a way to give graduate students an opportunity to communicate science to a broader audience. So usually we're sort of locked away in our caves, and we usually only talk about our science with other scientists, but this sort of gives us an opportunity to not only communicate with scientists that we might not interact with usually, but also with a broader community. So thank you guys for coming out and supporting us. We have one more event this year, this semester. So that will be April 26th. We'll be posting announcements about it. It'll be, fingers crossed, science in the movies. So we'll be debunking some popular science myths. So we look forward to having you guys there. That one will actually be at SCLO Library. Sort of been bouncing around, trying out different venues this semester. But we'll be back again in the fall. We do an event every month, so look for us. We also have a Facebook, a Twitter, a website, all that fun social media stuff that I don't really understand. If you are interested in any of that, we have our little flyers up here in case you're interested. Today, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and he'll give a short talk, 10 to 15 minutes. We'll have a break. We'll do some fun trivia, hopefully see what you guys learned, and then we'll have our second speaker, and then we'll take questions for both at the end. So our first speaker is Sam Vosen, who is a second-year PhD student in the biology program at Penn State in the Fisher and Baum's lab. Studies the effects of oil on deep water communities, which he'll be talking about today. Sort of our theme today is life and death in the abyss. He also studies the effects of natural seeps on a particular coral species, which is found near those seeps, but he'll be talking today mostly about our deep water impacts. Take it away. Welcome, Sam.
So I'm going to talk to you guys today about deep water coral, and although there's lots of labs here at Penn State that study shallow tropical coral reefs that many of you may know, I'm going to teach you guys about deep water coral that many people don't know about. So here's one of my favorite corals. This is one that I study. This is a beautiful coral colony here. You can see lots of brittle stars live on this colony. But what makes these coral different, like I said, is that these live in the deep sea. So first, I want to teach you guys about how deep the deep sea really is. So on average, the deep sea, or the sea in general on average, is 2.3 miles deep. Now you may know what 2.3 miles is in terms of distance. When it comes to depth, 2.3 miles is unimaginably deep. So if you look at this picture here, this is the Empire State Building, and here's two workers who are at the very tip top of the Empire State Building. And if you look closely, you can see the cars in the street. You can see how high up these guys are from the street. Well, if the Empire State Building was on the sea floor, and those streets were driving on the sea floor, to get to the surface of the ocean, you had to be 10 times taller than the Empire State Building. So you can imagine that distance times 10 is the average depth of the ocean. It's unimaginably deep. And this is just the average depth, but the ocean gets much deeper. The ocean can get, the deepest point of the ocean is 6.8 miles deep. And if you put Mount Everest in the deepest point of the ocean, Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench, the sea surface would be 1.25 miles above the Mount Everest. So this is a picture here of a hot air balloon that's about 1.25 miles above Mount Everest. You can kind of imagine what it'd be like to be at the sea surface and looking down at Mount Everest in the deepest point of the ocean. So not only is the ocean unimaginably deep, it's huge. The deep ocean spreads over the entire world. So over 60%, that's over half of Earth's surface area, is over 1 mile or more of water. If you look at this picture here, you can get an impression of how expansive the deep sea is. Everywhere that's dark purple, the water's over 1 mile deep. So if you know the Blue Planet series, the BBC series, talking about Earth, describes as the blue planet. We're not the blue planet, we're the black planet, because most of the planet is deep sea. So despite how deep the sea is, there's still things that can live on this sea floor. So one organism I'm going to focus on that lives on the sea floor in the deep sea are coral. So you can see here, here's some coral that are related to what people call sea fans. You can see they kind of shaped like a fan. But what is a coral? Not many people really know what a coral is. And a coral is a colonial animal. So if we zoom in here on the coral, you can see that this coral is composed of little individual organisms, little individual animals that are connected by tissue. And these guys are related to jellyfish. You can kind of imagine these guys as jellyfish connected together by their back, by their skeleton. And although these are colonial organisms, they're not like colonial in terms like an ant colony, in that an individual can't be more or less independent. They're more like leaves on a tree, but these still are animals. So how does an organism like this make a living on the deep sea? What does it eat? So you can see here, this picture, this is what we call marine snow. And what this is, it's plankton that do photosynthesis at the surface of the ocean, and it dies, and it slowly falls all the way down. It rains down down to the sea floor. And these deep water coral sit there on the deep sea floor and wait for this food to land on them, and they eat this marine snow. But as you can imagine, it's not a lot of food. So since there's so little food, these coral grow really slowly. And since they grow so slowly, they live forever. They live really long. So here is a black coral, and it's named because its black skeleton, you can see the bottom of the colony here, it's black. And its skeleton grows a lot like a tree trunk, in that it adds a layer every year. And if you cut this colony at its base, you can count the rings. Here you can see a picture of the rings. You can count the rings on the skeleton and count how many years old this colony is. Well, this coral here was growing off of Hawaii, and some scientists collected a few colonies and counted the rings to see how old it was. Well, this colony that they cut down was 4,265 years old. That's the oldest animal ever discovered. So that's unimaginably long-lived. So if you were to imagine, so what kind of things were happening on Earth 4,000 years ago? Well, that's when Stonehenge was finished. So if you imagine this one coral here, this coral that's pictured here, this colony, was born 4,000 years ago, settled on this rock and started to grow, and it's been growing ever since, collecting this marine snow that's slowly been raining on it as all of human history has been playing out on the surface. This colony's been sitting here off Hawaii in the same exact spot until some scientists got to it. So since coral can live, they live for so long, hundreds or thousands of years, some species can get huge. So this coral pictured here is called the bubblegum coral. You can see why it looks like chewing gum. It looks like it tastes good. So you probably can't quite tell from this picture how big this coral is, but this species can get over 10 meters tall. That's over 33 feet tall. You can see in this picture here, here's a scientist that has the base of this colony on this table. This coral is bigger than trees. It's a huge, huge coral, and it's found off New Zealand. Now, as you can see, deep water coral are incredibly diverse in form. Here's a coral. I don't even know how to describe this growth form. It's kind of a spiral. It's like a spiral feather. In fact, they're so diverse that there's more species of deep sea coral than corals in tropical shallow reefs. There's over 3,300 species of deep sea coral, and this number keeps on rising as the deep sea continues to be explored. So not only are the coral themselves diverse, but they support a diverse assemblage of other animals. So you can see in this picture all the animals that are having a party on this coral. You can see a bunch of brittle stars and squat lobsters. There's a bunch of other organisms you can't quite see, little relatives of slugs that are wrapped around the colony. And these coral provide habitat for these organisms. It allows them to get up off the sea floor, up where there's current, where they themselves can catch food. So not only do they provide habitat for invertebrates, they also provide habitat for fish. So this one site that we visit seems to be a consistent shark nursery. So cat sharks lay their eggs on these colonies that we monitor. You can see here a bunch of eggs laid on the colony. So instead of laying their eggs in the mud where the eggs probably won't develop, these cat sharks lay their eggs on the coral. So these coral allow these sharks to reproduce. So not only do they support shark populations, they also support large populations of fish. So here's a species of coral, Lophelia, you see in the foreground. and you see this large school of barracks fish swimming above it. It's kind of blurry, but it gives you a sense of how many fish can live around these reefs. And these species of fish is commercially fished. So we eat fish that spend their lives on these deep sea reefs. So in this particular species of coral can be found in U.S. waters. This coral can be found in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's incredibly important coral because 1,300 different species of animals have been found associated with just this one species of coral. And in fact, these deep sea reefs can support such a diversity of organisms that the diversity can even exceed tropical coral reefs on the Great Barrier Reef. So, and there's other coral reefs in U.S. waters. Here's some pictures of Alaskan coral communities around the Aleutian Islands. Just take a second to take in the beauty of these pictures. Around the Aleutian Islands, the diversity is insane. There's all these different species that are just packed together. It's really, really crazy. So not only are there coral, here's they are in the North Pole, they're also going to be found in the South Pole. So here's a picture of coral reefs found in Antarctica. So you can see, you can't even see the sea floor here. It's 100% coral cover, and you can see there's tons of brittle stars all over the coral. There's even an octopus. If you look closely, you can see an octopus swimming by. So these communities are incredibly productive, and they're packed with animals down in the deep sea. So where else can we find them if they're in both poles? Well, they pretty much can be found everywhere. So here's a picture of where all they've found deep water coral. So every place there's a plus sign, that's where deep water coral have been observed. And when you look at this map of the world, you see that they seem to be everywhere. But you have to realize that this map is far from complete, because we've only explored less than 5% of the sea floor. So as we explore more and more of the deep sea floor, this map will get denser and denser, and we'll find more and more coral. And an example of that, of discovering more and more coral, here we found corals in our own backyard. So this is the Gulf of Maine here. You can see Massachusetts and Maine. In the waters right here, in U.S. waters, in 2013 they just found a bunch of coral growing right here in Maine. So what else will we find in the coming years right in our own backyard? So as in the coming years, there's going to be lots and lots of deep water exploration, and they're going to find really cool things. So you can experience this stuff live by going to sites like the Schmidt Ocean Institute's website at schmidtocean.org and watch these dives in real time. You can watch these discoveries as they happen. Also, you can see this on the Ocean Exploration Trust website at the dives that take place from the EV Nautilus. So you can watch these discoveries as they happen. So I hope I impressed on you guys how important deep sea environments are. They're all over the world, and the deep sea floor is packed with life and packed with coral, and they're important to us, at least because we eat some species that live in these reefs. So with that, thanks. And here's a deep sea hermit crab.
PhD student in the Fisher Lab, the biology department here. She also studies deep sea corals, which she'll be talking about today. And her goal for her research is to determine how corals were impacted by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and how they're recovering using some time series.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming
images.
today to listen to us. So now I hope that you understand how deep sea corals are important and why we should care and protect them. And for this presentation, I'm going to tell you about human threats on deep sea corals. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico because this is what I've been studying for my PhD. So here's the northern Gulf of Mexico. You can see here is Louisiana and New Orleans is in this area. And so where the marker is here is where the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened. So you have here a photo of the oil platform. So it's a platform that belonged to BP. And it exploded in April 2010. And then 2 days after the explosion, the platform sank and it broke the rice pipe that was connecting the seafloor to the platform, which led to one of the largest oil spills in history. So the oil spill lasted 87 days before the well was capped, and during this period of time, almost 5 million barrels of crude oil were released directly into the deep ocean. And it seems like a big number, so to give you a better idea of what this represents, if we had processed all this oil and that we had made diesel and gas out of it, we would have had enough for 8 SUVs and 1 truck to cover a distance equivalent to a round trip to Mars. So that's a lot of oil. But what actually makes this oil spill unique is the fact that it happened directly into the deep sea, because the other oil spill before happened at the surface. But here, the oil leaked at a depth of 1,500 meters. So here's just a schematic that shows what happened. You have here the well, where the oil was leaking. Part of it stayed trapped into the deep ocean, but another part of it actually reached the surface of the ocean. And so you have here, the oil came to the surface. You have here a satellite map that represents the surface detection of oil in the Gulf. And you can see in red, this is where oil was detected. So it is covering actually a very large area of the northern Gulf of Mexico. So here are some dramatic photos that you would find if you Google Deepwater Horizon oil spill on the internet. So the first organisms that we see are impacted are usually marine mammals. Birds are often observed to be impacted because obviously people can see them directly from the shore. They are covered in oil, as well as sea turtles, for instance. But also entire ecosystems, such as the salt marshes that you find in Louisiana and in Florida, where you see here all this oil that is covering the marshes, which is a big problem because actually a lot of birds are using this area as a nursery and a lot of organisms live there. But how about under the ocean? What happened to organisms that live at the bottom of the sea? So clearly we are studying coral, so this is what I'm going to talk about. So I told you part of the oil stayed trapped, so it formed this deep water plume that just moved along with the current, and this affected actually some deep sea coral communities. Also what happened is that the oil that came to the surface, at some point it started aggregating and sank back to the ocean. So Sam told you about marine snow, so this formed actually some kind of very toxic marine snow that fell on deep sea corals directly. So here's an example. So in November 2010, a deep sea coral community was discovered pretty close to the well, and at this site, the corals look like this. So you can see on this image, you see this sort of black material that is on the branches. So these branches were collected, and this material actually contained oil that came from the Macondo well, so we know that these corals were impacted by oil. And just to give you an idea, this is the same species of coral, a little bit further away. So this is actually how this coral should be looking like. And you clearly see that this is very different. You don't see any polyps. The color is very different. So this is just an example. 1 year later, we actually discovered 2 more sites. So this image here is actually the same coral as the one that you saw on the previous slide, but 1 year afterward. And you see the oil is actually gone, but the coral is not healthy. It's still not doing well. And these 2 other corals were found at 2 other sites that are also close to the well, but a little bit further away. And you see they show the same type of impact as the first one. So we know that these corals were also very likely impacted by the spill. So it's just a map with some sites that I'm looking at. But what's interesting is here's the well, and here are the 3 sites I just told you about. So it's pretty close. And so for my PhD, what I'm interested in is, okay, what is the impact on coral, and what is the long-term impact of the oil spill on corals, and how these corals are recovering. And for that, all my analyses are based on images, so I'm doing image analysis. So what we do basically is every single year, we go to the same sites and we image the exact same coral colonies. And we really try to use the same camera settings, so we have images that we actually can compare. And then we compare these images and see if the coral is recovering or if it's not, and if it's not, then what type of impact do we see. So just to give you a better idea on how we work, I have here 2 videos. So this is what we see when we are working with the ROV in the control van. And there are 2 videos here because this was the setting. So we have 2 submersibles that are connected. The one in yellow here, which is this video here, is the main submersible that we use. So we put the camera on it and we can take the photos with the camera directly. The one on the top is another submersible that will actually take videos of the first ones to make it easier for the pilot basically to move and to make sure that we're not going to sit with the submersible on some old coral colonies. So I'm just going to play the videos. How do I do that? So this is basically when we see corals, we move close to them. This is accelerated, obviously it takes longer than this, but just for you, I accelerated the video. So we find a coral, we'll sit in front of it, and then with the camera, I decide what is the right angle, and then take a photo. And here, just to show you, the corals are here. So these corals are actually pretty small if you compare to our submersible. And you can see here a wiffle ball, so that gives you an idea also how big they are, because the wiffle ball is like this size pretty much. So here's the type of data that I get. So this is an example. So it's a very extreme example because that's a coral that is very impacted. But this coral was imaged for the first time in 2010. And we imaged it last year again. And here are the time series. And you can clearly see that we're really trying to make an effort to take the exact same photo every year, even though it is really difficult. And what you notice on this is that this coral is actually not recovering very well. Okay, this area seems a little bit healthier than it used to be, but barely. Most of the coral is still very impacted. And it's very hard to see just on the screen right now, but the coral actually lost a lot of branches. So you see this branch here, it's now gone. So little pieces of branches everywhere on the colony broke off. And this is actually an even worse type of impact because Sam told you that these corals grow very slowly. So imagine if they lose an entire branch, how long that would take for the branch to grow again. And so this is the type of data that I get from these corals. And actually, image analysis has a lot of advantages because we take very high definition photos, so we can really make a difference also between different types of impact. So for instance, if you zoom in on this coral, you see, oh, this is dead. You don't see any polyps, it's clearly bare skeleton, or this branch is dead. You can also see sometimes when the branches die and the skeleton is exposed, other organisms can actually colonize the dead skeleton and grow on them. So this is what you see here. You see those little sticks coming out. These are called hydroids, so they're also they're closely related to corals and they form colonies as well. And they will colonize the skeleton, which makes it even harder for the coral to recover because it is now in competition with those other organisms that are colonizing it. And what I actually really like about this method is that it's a non-destructive method. So if we go every year, we get samples, but we don't damage the corals. We're just taking photos, we're not sampling them. Especially these corals are already very impacted. I would actually feel really bad if I was collecting them on top of that. So before I end this talk, I just want to mention other threats to corals because, okay, oil spills are very impressive, but they are still accidental and they happen fairly rarely. But there are more threats that are actually more constant, actually more dangerous, if I can put it that way. And one of them is fisheries. And for several reasons, for instance, you can have long lines that get entangled in corals, which damages them. But the threat I actually want to talk about is bottom trawling. So we have a postdoc now in our lab that did a lot of work on bottom trawling, so she gave me some photos that I'm going to show you later. But basically, how does that work? So you have a ship called a trawler that will be dragging this gigantic net over the seafloor. And the goal is actually to get a few fish species that live close to the seafloor. The problem is those fishes, they often live also close to corals because they form habitat for them or they find food there. But if you see this gigantic net just dragging on the seafloor, it's just going to break everything on the way. And I don't remember if you remember Sam's presentation, this big bubblegum coral. Well, see for instance, this is the same species, and you would kill a coral that is thousands of years just at once with this method. So I'm going to show you some examples. So here are corals. So these photos were taken on the west coast, so between Canada and Alaska. And so this is another coral species, but you can see the diversity associated. You have some crabs, fishes. I think some of these are actually targeted by fisheries. And so those corals grow on hard substrates. And I added here a photo. So this is not a coral. This is actually a sponge. So I just wanted to put it here because we've been talking a lot about corals, but corals are not the only important deep sea ecosystem. So some sponges actually form reefs like this, and they're actually very important because also associated with a lot of diversity. And these are photos that were taken in the same area, but a little bit further away. And you can see those rocks. These, they don't have corals on them. You can see here a little piece of net, so you know that, oh, a trawler came. And you have here a big pile. And actually, in this pile, it's mainly dead sponges, dead pieces of corals, and basically the current just accumulated them in this area. So just to show you the damages that it does. So I'm asking, okay, what can we do to protect them? So I'm asking this question, maybe if you guys are interested, we can have a conversation about that, like what can we do to protect deep sea corals? But before that, I'm just going to talk about a little bit the regulations in the US for oil and gas exploration and a few measures that are taken to protect corals. So what are the regulations right now? Let's say you are an oil company and you want to start drilling. So what you have to do first is to do ROV surveys. So you have a submersible that is going to do transects and surveys to make sure that there are no corals or sponges in the area. If you find corals and the densities are high enough, then these have to be classified as vulnerable marine ecosystem. If this is the case, then there has to be a safe distance defined around it. So usually the regulations for corals are you are not allowed to drill within 500 meters near the corals. You're not allowed to do any disturbance to the seafloor within 100 meters, which, okay, it's not a lot actually, because, okay, you're not drilling on the coral, but when you drill, there's a lot of sediment that gets resuspended, and the current can break this sediment on the coral, so this actually can damage them. And so basically, there's a lot of gaps in these regulations, also because the vulnerable marine ecosystem is not very well, this definition is not very well defined. Like what are the densities? Is there a limit density to define an ecosystem as vulnerable marine ecosystem? So the regulations could actually be improved at every single step. Another way that is actually a great way to protect corals is to define marine protected areas. So on Earth right now, most of the marine protected areas are shallow water, but there's a bigger effort now to actually start protecting deep sea ecosystem. So I read that recently New Zealand included in a marine sanctuary near Kermadec deep sea hydrothermal vents. And in the US, there is a nice example, which is the example of the Davidson seamount. So it's a seamount here that is located off California. And it was included in 2008 to the National Marine Sanctuary of Monterey Bay. And seamounts are very important. They are basically an underwater mountain, and they are often covered by a lot of corals. So this is just a photo of the Davidson seamount. See lots of coral, lots of organisms living there. And because of that, they also targeted a lot by fisheries. And so this is a big step to decide to protect them. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions.
Did you see any indication that the dispersant caused damage to the corals?
So in my study, I'm just looking at visual impact, so I clearly kind of make a difference. Is this dispersant or oil that affected them? But those branches that I told you that were collected and they found traces of oil, they also found a component of dispersant in it. So clearly we know that in this black material that was covering coral, there was dispersant. But yeah, the question is it oil, is it dispersant, is it both? It's hard to answer that.
Did they release the dispersant at depth, or was it just
Both.
on the surface?
Yeah, they released part of it by plane. So most of it was by plane at the surface, but they did release directly at the well also.
I don't know whether this, to go off that question, perhaps this is a controversial issue here. Isn't the general consensus that we did more damage than good by because of the dispersant?
Well, yeah, it is a tricky issue.
Not the place.
I mean, there was tank experiments that were done with corals, and people in our lab did that. I mean, if you want to talk about it. But.
Yeah, so there have been some studies or experiments to see the effects of dispersant, and it's not good for the coral. It's usually toxic, but if you're talking about a large scale, whether it was better to use the dispersant or not, that's hard to say.
Also, it's a concentration issue because when you do lab experiment, you use high concentration, but you actually don't know what concentration the corals were exposed to, so it's a little difficult to answer that.
The spill in the Gulf, how long has the study been going on? Where are we at? They studied other spills?
I mean, for our group, we've been studying it for 5 years now, and it's still ongoing. So we're still gonna go collect data this year about these corals. About other, I mean, we are not looking at other oil spills right now, but
There are other oil spills that have been studied, but I think this might be one of the biggest oil spills that's been studied because so much money that BP has provided for scientific research.
yeah. So previous oil spills were more focused on like seabirds or any shore impact because the oil spill happened at the surface, and no one really saw like if deep sea ecosystems were actually impacted or not, which they might have been, but we didn't study them. Yeah.
I don't know whether this question is just for you guys or for the said postdoc. So, as a consumer, what are the fish that we should avoid to save corals?
Sharice would probably know this best.
I don't know also in English.
So those particular corals, you want to avoid the long-lived rockfish, which are all of them. So bottom-dwelling fish would be a no-go because you just think about how they catch bottom-dwelling fish. It's going to be with those trawl nets. So yeah, target those active swimming ones, like mid-water. Yeah, sea levels frigate. I don't know.
So you said that there is sharks or other organisms that go to the surface and go down. They go that deep, or like how deep do they usually, like for example, sharks?
So there's lots of species of sharks and relatives that will stay at depth and live their entire lives at depth. There's other species that will do migrations and go down to the reefs during the day and go up, and not just shark species, but other species. And there's other species that will spend part of their life in these deep sea reefs and go live their life elsewhere. So it's a mix of everything.
Adaptation of the pressure. How do they adapt to? Because it's a lot of pressure with
Right.
the difference of pressure.
So pressure doesn't affect fish, or they don't have the same problems with pressure that we do. So we have some issues because we breathe air, and it gives us issues with our lungs. But fish have other issues with depth, but it's usually easier to have an adaptation to. So there's a lot of fish that can go to have a wide range of depth. Yeah.
With the Gulf spill, you're still, you were saying that in your presentation here, that there's a level of oil in the depths. Is that oil still in there too? Or is it been collected? Do we know that the spill's been 5 years, but it's still doing damage too? Is that part of this in your study too?
I'm not sure the fate of all the oil in the Gulf of Mexico, but a lot of it has been degraded through chemical and biological processes. I'm not sure how much is left. I'm not sure that's known.
I mean, a lot of it has been collected. Then there's been a lot of models that were developed to try to track where it went, because with the currents, like, it's difficult to follow. A lot of it probably, yes, I'd say degraded. But for sure on the corals, there's no more oil. What we see now is just the consequences of the initial exposure to oil. Yeah.
See the restoration efforts on shore and on land. Did they have to do anything, or were there any restoration efforts?
Yes, we actually started to think about this, and we have some project of maybe trying to regrow corals, like they do in the shallow water. So if you take a little snip of a coral and then you replant it, kind of.
Yeah.
But I don't think we don't know if this is possible, but we've been talking a little bit about it. But
as far as you know, BP isn't going to be held accountable for doing any restoration efforts.
But the money, they gave money. Like all the money that was given was both for research, and part of it is actually a big part of it is for restoration. And I think we got some significant part also for deep sea. So that's why we need to really figure out what we could do to
So
help.
your research is part of their restoration effort, like you guys get funding from them?
Yes. we
Yeah.
will.
Yeah. Pretty cool. I should know that.
A few more minutes for questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, I think our speakers will be hanging around for a few minutes if you want to come up and talk to them. Thank you again for coming tonight. Hopefully you guys learned something, can take something back with you. Like I said, we have an event next month, the end of next month, scheduled for April 26th. That'll be at SCLO. Do want to thank Webster's for hosting us here, being really great, getting this scheduled. And then there's also a bunch of committee members here that sort of help organize this, so thank you to all of those guys. We wouldn't be able to put this on without you guys. And thank our speakers.